Bien. Just passing around handouts. Just getting the YouTube going.
Yeah.
Hola, buenas tardes. Gracias por venir. Gracias por todo su interés en esta conferencia. Soy Tom Donahue Ochoa. Soy profesor en Haverford College en Ciencias Políticas. Mucho gusto y gracias otra vez. And thank you very much. We very much appreciate your interest in this colloquium, in this mini conference. So what we're calling it is the Turmoils of Compromise, Navigating Mass Crimes and Transitional Justice. And we have 6 participants, presenters today. We have Juan Espíndola, who is a researcher here in the Institute for Philosophical Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We have Colleen Murphy, who's professor, I think, both in the law school and in the philosophy department at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. We have Pablo Kalmanovitz, who is professor, researcher at the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico. We have Isabel Biza Gomez, who is in the Violence and Transitional Justice Lab at the University of Notre Dame. Then on Zoom, we have Paulina Ochoa, who is professor of political science at Haverford College. And we have Ashwini Basantakumar, who is professor of philosophy of law at Queen's Law School. So the theme for today is navigating mass crimes and transitional justice. And we're very glad to have people who have already written a lot about this. Colleen has written one of the important books on the concept of transitional justice. So thank you for coming. And we have various takes on it. So I thought I would just quickly think about those takes. The overall theme, and I'll just try to share quickly with you, of this gathering is to theorize the margins of the global order as entangled centers. And so basically what the overall project is doing is trying to think about how the centers of power in the global north have basically dominated theorizing. And so most theorizing that occurs outside of those centers had to accommodate itself to the assumptions that those centers make about how the world works, about how it should work. And what we have today is 6 presentations, each of which is trying to think from outside of those centers of power, to think from different perspectives than the ones that usually dominate. So those would be, for example, the dominant ones in the global centers of power usually tend to assume that there is a powerful state which has many capacities and can deal with most problems, or that there are international institutions which are also well-resourced and capable, certainly if they work together, of solving many problems. But we have here Juan, for example, taking the perspective of states and international institutions deciding how to hold big tech accountable for users of its platforms and for when they amplify messages that spark mass atrocities. Colleen taking the perspective of the victims of oppression or of unjust war, and they're trying to decide to engage with those they think have unjustly victimized them. And this is all occurring in deeply divided societies. So again, a different assumption and a different perspective than the ones that are the standard fare in global centers of power. Pablo taking the perspective, as I understand it, of the state and societies that are torn by organized criminal violence. And they are trying, these states, to decide how to enforce the law against organized criminal groups. So again, a difference from the usual assumption that you have a powerful, well-resourced state dealing with problems. Isabel taking the perspective of the state, also in a society, this time torn by decades of civil war, and interestingly, I think also the perspective of the largest rebel group in that war, and both of them trying to decide what to do about smaller rebel groups and organized criminal groups who continue the mass violence, often by hiring retired members of state security forces, which is a familiar theme in Mexican current politics, if you think of the Zetas and others. Paulina taking the perspective of internally displaced persons, whereas the dominant discussion in the global centers of power tends to be what the state should do about internally displaced persons and refugees. Paulina's taking the perspective of those persons and also of those left behind in towns that have been devastated by mass violence among organized criminal groups, paramilitaries, and state forces, as has happened here in Mexico, and the example is Aguililla. And Ashwini, I think, very interestingly, the perspective of those in a diaspora of a minority community in a nation who have basically been forced to leave that country because of state repression in a civil war between the minority and the state, the majority, in which an armed group claimed to represent the minority, but was not accepted by all members of that minority as the true representative. And what it did was basically try to crush other political parties, which also claimed to be speaking for some members of this minority group. So the question then is both, how can the diaspora be involved in transitional justice in the country, and the example that Ashwini is using is Sri Lanka, but also to think about how within that diaspora, there are all these political issues and debates among people who did not support the armed group, which managed to crush all the opposition forces within the minority group. So I think that illustrates, I hope, what this project of reconnecting theory is trying to do, to bring in these perspectives that are so often ignored or just written out of the dominant global centers of powers ways of theorizing. That's what we have in mind for today, and thank you all for these really exciting talks. So we're going to take them in pairs. We're going to have 2 presentations and then discussion and a very short break, then the next 2 and the next 2. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Juan, please, and I'll try to share your presentation.
Can you hear me, Inson? Okay, great. Well, let me begin by thanking Tom for organizing this, and it's great to see all of you there in the screen. Hopefully, next time you'll be able to come to Mexico City. And so let me begin by just telling you a little bit about what this project is. Well, yeah, so there it is. So this is part of a project that I'm just beginning, so this is very much work in progress. So I'm looking forward to your comments. I'm going to talk to you about the involvement of big tech companies in mass atrocity and how they raise multiple challenges for the aspiration of transitional justice to attribute legal and political responsibility to wrongdoers and their accomplices. And I think this the involvement of big tech companies raises challenges for many reasons. One is because of the kind of actor big tech companies are. They are organizationally complex and profit-oriented. By the way, as you have seen, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going through the handout. Then they raise a challenge also because of the kind of service they provide. They provide what we might call platforming, which is hosting speech, but also creating speech in a way, as I will be discussing in a little while. And they raise challenges also because of how speech is formed in the platforms. It's I will be arguing, formed spontaneously in some ways, but also through manipulation. And so the point of this project, or this paper, at least this presentation, is to sketch a framework for responsibility attribution in transitional circumstances, which can illuminate the grounds for ascribing responsibility for big tech companies. I think they bear more responsibility than is usually acknowledged. And so in a similar vein, the framework can serve as a basis to argue that Facebook and other platforms like it should be a part of transitional justice processes to a much greater extent than it has been the case so far. So that's a little bit the goal. So for the purposes of the presentation, I am going to divide it into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about very briefly about Ethiopia, which I think can serve as an example, the civil war there, I mean. Then I'm going to talk about the how I think we should understand Facebook. I'm going to focus on Facebook, but again, I have other social media platforms in mind. So I'm going to argue in the second section that try to sketch how I think we should conceive of Facebook's responsibility in mass atrocity, And finally, I'm going to try to lay out what the implications for transitional justice are. So, Tom, could you tell me when I have 5 minutes? Thank you. Okay, so very briefly, the example of Ethiopia. As many of you may know, there was a civil war in Ethiopia. It started in 2020, and then there was a peace agreement in 2022. I mean, Ethiopia has been a very conflictive society since time immemorial, but I'm just thinking about this last civil war, and there were crimes against humanity committed, ethnic cleansing against an ethnic minority, the Tigrayans, I think that's how you pronounce it, and other kinds of crimes, weaponized rape, genocide, etc. And Facebook, which has among about 6 million users in Ethiopia, was a key avenue through which narratives targeting and dehumanizing this minority spread. So, for instance, in July of 2021, the Prime Minister posted a comment about the minority, saying that they were weed that must be pulled out. And you found lots of comments like this, dehumanizing the minority, and they were very widely spread and widely commented. So most of the criticism of Facebook and of the self-criticism of Facebook as well revolved around its failure to moderate content, to take down content that was dehumanizing, or its meager moderation tools. So you had comments about there not being human moderators who knew the local language, or comments about the outsourcing of content moderation to a company in Kenya, which had deplorable working conditions for the employees. Or you read about the underdeveloped alternative AI moderation techniques. And all those criticisms are on point, but I think they miss an important consideration to understand the full extent of Facebook's responsibility. I think they misrepresent the nature and the degree of the corporation's responsibility. And so that's number one in the handout. And moving on to number two, where I try to explain why I think this representation is wrong, and what the correct account of Facebook's responsibility is in the mass atrocity in the Ethiopian context, but in other contexts as well. I think that to do that, we need to understand what kind of toxic speech, toxic speech is. So, what the origin of that toxic speech that we find in Facebook is, and so the question is, put briefly, whose speech is toxic speech? I think there are three possibilities that are not mutually exclusive. So first, when we think about toxic speech in Facebook, we might think that it's speech that's originated in or that's created by third-party actors. So we can think of political actors, like in the Ethiopia example, but then we can also think about foreign actors via like trolls, and Russia would be the perfect example here, the Russian troll farms. And this is the most common view, I think, among citizens and even international organizations. It's also the source of liability protections for companies like Facebook. So the idea is that their speech is not theirs. That the speech there is not really theirs. It's created by other actors. We could also think that the speech that we find in Facebook is the speech of users. So ordinary users, come into the platform with prejudices, etc., and then they're simply magnified by the platform. And thirdly, we could think that the speech is in fact co-produced by the platform, in the sense that it encourages hateful content through its algorithms for the sake of profit. And people who do discuss this, particularly criminologists, they talk about, what one of them refers to as algorithmic deviance amplification, or criminogenic filter bubbles, or they point towards the what they call affordances in the digital architecture. Like one example is anonymity, the fact that people can post things anonymously, in a way enables them and encourages them to be very mean and very toxic, to put it crudely. And so the main point I want to get at is that platforms create a realm of manipulation. That would be the most important claim I want to make. Right? And here by manipulation, I have a pretty standard understanding of manipulation. Manipulation is a kind of deliberately surreptitious influence that's extortive, that's unrational, that it's oftentimes deceitful, and that seeks to take advantage of the manipulee's cognitive vulnerabilities and emotional vulnerabilities. And the point is that that the manipulator joists his interests or upon the manipulee. So what I want to claim is that platforms do not simply host the toxic speech of others. They are, in fact, its co-creator. So we usually find this label when we if you're reading literature about content moderation, you usually find the term user-generated content. I think that's a bit of a misnomer because the content is not really, or it's not only generated by the user, but it's also generated, I think I would claim, by the platform. And of course, platform owners do not need to endorse the content of the speech. They may even repudiate toxic speech, but they do create an environment for the sake of profit in which these manipulative interactions prevail, which in turn gives rise to or exacerbates toxic speech. Right? And if this is true, then that means that platforms are responsible in many different ways. So they are responsible for what they fail to do. So they do not purge toxic speech, but they're also responsible for what they do, which is create toxic speech. So in other words, I'm arguing that we can conceptualize Facebook's responsibility in two ways: as failing to react to the wrongdoing of others, but also as committing wrongdoing itself. So, and on that note, we reach the end of section 2 in the handout. And so let me tell you what that means for transitional justice. And how am I doing on the time? Okay, so what I want to claim is that if Facebook responsibility in mass atrocity is simply that it's failed to act or to react swiftly enough to take down content, so if we think that Facebook is merely a conduit for the speech of others, then this suggests a really modest scope for transitional justice processes when it comes to coming to terms with Facebook's contribution to wrongdoing. If, by contrast, our account of Facebook's responsibility considers how the corporation edifies a sphere of manipulation for Facebook itself to exploit or for others to exploit, then its role in mass atrocity is very significant, and therefore the place of Facebook within transitional justice processes should be much larger. So to make this point, I want to consider two tools in the transitional justice toolkit, and that would be criminal trials and guarantees of non-repetition. So I'm here just using the standard transitional justice toolkit. And so if we consider guarantees of non-repetition, I think that if we endorse the kind of responsibility that I think Facebook has, then we would have to shift from the idea that guarantees of non-repetition should focus on reactive policies like content moderation, just in the sense of taking down comment or suspending accounts that are promoting hateful speech. And we should, in fact, focus on preemptive policies, right? So I think that content moderation is an appropriate policy, and I mean, corporations should conduct it, of course, but I don't think it should be the main tool. And in fact, I think that if we reject the notion of Facebook as a mere conduit of the speech of others and endorse the representation that I'm sketching here, then we have, in fact, a much more robust grounds for promoting content moderation. But I'm not going to get into that. The main point, the main concern that I have is that if we endorse content moderation as the main tool, then we overlook the depth and the source of the problem. And so I think that corporations should use a preemptive strategy that consists in redesigning the algorithms that are used to capture the attention of users and which also promote toxic speech. So, and this would imply, for instance, that we might have to ban the use of targeted advertising, which is the main tool of corporations to capture the attention of users. But this means, just to put it very shortly, is that we need, as part of a transitional justice process, opening the so-called black box of corporations like Facebook is an important part of the story, and that would be, I think, we could say that even an important part of truth-telling processes in transitional justice. And then very briefly, with respect to criminal trials, I think that if we endorse the correct understanding of Facebook's responsibility, then we shift more decisively in the direction of we shift more decisively towards foreseeability rather than intention. So usually in criminal trials that are important for transitional justice, the focus has been to determine whether corporations intended to collaborate with a repressive regime, for instance, or with other non-state actors that were promoting violence. And that of course is not the case for big tech, because big tech does not intend for others to spew toxic speech. But the important question is whether the companies could have or should have been able to foresee the ill intent that others had in using their services, right? And so I think that if we have the standard understanding of Facebook's responsibility, then I mean we already are interested in foreseeability rather than intentions. But it's a different kind. It's a much more watered down idea of foreseeability. I think it's just the idea that platforms have to investigate, or as best as they can, whether third parties are going to use their services with evil intentions. But that's always subject to controversy, if that's a good way to put it. The sense that corporations can always claim that they cannot anticipate to the full extent what others are going to do, and so that's an avenue for them to get off the hook, to put it shortly. Whereas the kind of foreseeability that I have in mind is a foreseeability that has to do with Facebook's own algorithms and the way in which they try to capture the attention of users. And that's a kind of foreseeability it's more within the reach of the corporation, that has nothing to do with third-party actors, and that should be the focus of these corporations, and that should be the focus also of transitional justice processes. And I think I'm running out of time, so I would leave it at that. But so the point is to summarize that I think that we have to change our understanding of what Facebook is responsible for, and if we do that, then I think we can all agree that transitional justice will have much more to say about the role of Facebook in mass atrocities. Okay.
Thank you very much, Juan. And I'd just also like to say that Juan is the author of Transitional Justice After German Reunification, with a lot of careful analysis of the responsibilities of collaborators. So thank you for that. And thinking about whether or not Facebook users might be collaborating and how. Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Colleen.
Yeah.
Would you like to take it away?
Tom, do you want me to share my screen, or how do you want me to show my slides?
Okay. We're making you co-host.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So let me just put my slides here. Can you all see the slides?
Yes.
Oh, I don't know if I want this view, but well, we'll continue. I'm sure. So first, Tom, thanks for the invitation to be here. And my presentation in many ways follows nicely from Juan's. I'll put a plug in for his book as well. It's very good. Because it's also trying to change discourse in terms of how we position the United States in the context of transitional justice. And so think of the US as not, as it's often conceptualized, sort of outside of the discourse of transitional justice, but really as a subject of transitional justice, in desperate need of transitional justice, and where the wisdom of how to do that lies in drawing on comparative experiences outside of the US. So another way of framing the different sort of perspective that I want to bring. So I am going to start with just the basic thought of my paper, which is oriented around an emotion that doesn't get as much attention in the literature as other sorts of emotions like resentment and anger and hatred that do, and that is contempt. And so I started thinking about the place of contempt after reading a piece by philosopher Michelle Mason and work by McAllister Bell on in defense of contempt. And in particular, Michelle Mason argues that for the defensibility of a permanent contempt for cases of Nazis like Stangl. And what I want to do is problematize the idea that the epistemic conditions that need to be in place for contempt to be properly focused and justified in transitional contexts that are where you've got deeply divided communities trying to navigate compromises and move to a better place, that those are almost never present. And so contempt, rather than thinking that Nazis are easy cases for permanent contempt, they're actually, I think, the hardest case or among the hardest than Nazi analog sorts of cases. So I'll start with how Michelle Mason defines contempt, which is just a reactive attitude that's responsive to the will of another. So not so much the actions, but the will as reflective of who someone is. And when we hold someone in contempt, we regard them as low in their worth as a person because they fail to meet some interpersonal ideal that they should meet, and that the contemner endorses, even if she doesn't actually succeed in herself meeting. So it's about the character of the person who's the object of contempt, a view of their relative inferiority, and the effective responsive contempt is of repulsion or aversion. And when contempt is especially strong, this repulsion and aversion can permeate our interactions with the object of our contempt. And she writes, can it at some point so contaminate our view of another that there's a point beyond which forgiveness and reconciliation might no longer be forthcoming. So Mason recognizes that defending contempt is not a simple task, and she says there's conditions that need to be in place for it to be defensible. You've got to be responding to a person because he or she in fact did violate an ideal that is reflective of some sort of character trait that we rightly can evaluate because it's one that they are responsible for, and we're legitimate in expecting that they demand or meet that ideal, and we're not hypocritical. That if we were guilty of the same violation, we would regard ourselves as permissibly subject to the same contempt that we hold for the other. And Mason tries to ward off worries about contempt by saying, look, justified contempt of the kind that she's interested in is different than bigotry. We're not viewing someone as inferior as a person because of who they are in terms of ethnicity or sex or color of skin, but on the basis of who they are, that is in some sense under their control. That's a function of their choices and decisions, and that there is Contempt is fundamentally compatible with seeing and recognizing the dignity of others, even those who are subject to our contempt or objects of our contempt, because what we're not foregoing when we hold someone in contempt is recognition, respect that is not earned, that's a function of our being persons, and that imposes negative constraints on action. So, don't torture Stangl. We can't do that. We just don't have to hang out with him or interact with him. But rather the target is appraisal respect, which is earned, and that's what the object of our contempt doesn't deserve. That way of navigating the compatibility of contempt with respect is the subject of an objection by Tom Hill, who argues that what you really are foregoing in cases of permanent contempt is recognition respect, not appraisal respect, because our moral concepts presume an ideal of deliberation with our fellow agents in deciding what kind of moral principles will govern us. And for that to happen, we have to view everyone as potential co-legislators. And to do that, we have to be able to or willing to engage with them. And so if we're not willing to engage, then we're kind of giving up on the recognition respect that is grounded in a recognition of others as persons. We're not giving up on appraisal respect. And Mason essentially says in response, she doesn't directly address the question of whether what we're giving up is recognition or appraisal respect. Instead, she just returns to the view that, look, under certain conditions, that is what someone gives up, this claim on us of some prospect for engagement. You can forfeit that. And that's what certain morally egregious people do. And specifically do with respect to their victims. There's no demand for engagement that exists there. So why I find this intriguing for transitional justice specifically is that if Mason is right, of course, it has widespread implications because you are dealing with cases of mass atrocity, mass crimes. And so many individuals will presumably meet the conditions for contempt that Mason lays out. So it's not of marginal interest. And in fact, unsurprisingly, you find contempt as a feature of transitional societies, the traditional and recognized ones. And I'll just illustrate it with respect to the US, which again, I think is a site of the need for transitional justice, though to some extent the views are changing, but historically that hasn't been thought of as being so. So you find in contemporary discourse in American politics, the labeling of political adversaries as Nazis or fascists. So after January 6th, the auto coup, opinion writer basically said, Republicans shouldn't be called Republicans. That's not accurately describing who they are. They're fascists. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is often in the news Republican, basically during the COVID crisis, said after President Biden had promised to bring medical personnel into communities that were in need of greater access to vaccines. Essentially, this is what Nazis do. These are medical brown shirts setting up at our door. And there was a psychologist who studied sort of political attitudes in the United States in the last few years and reported on the ways in which Democrats increasingly view or perceive faces they label as Republicans as physically disgusting and vice versa. So the repulsion and aversion aspect of contempt is, shaping political discourse and political interaction. And just some other data on, contempt as a just defining constitutive feature of contemporary American politics. Another poll asking Republicans about their view of Democrats revealed that only 1/4 thought that Democrats actually voted with an eye to the best interest of the country. Most Democrats were viewed instead as being brainwashed by the mainstream media or voting in their self-interest for getting free stuff and food stamps, where there's all sorts of racialized metaphors that are underpinning that sort of characterization. And, Democrats are Devilcrats, and Republicans being viewed by Democrats in terms like, I like dictators, I'm a racist, I hate non-whites. One reason why contempt is a problem in transitional contexts is that it makes the kind of shaking hands with the devil, as I call it, the kind of compromising and negotiation with folks with whom you are in conflict and you regard as the devil, really difficult, especially if you view your contempt as justified and justified in a permanent manner, right? You don't have to ever engage or negotiate with those who are the devil. And if, Democrats are the devil or Republicans are the devil, you just don't have to compromise or engage with anyone on the other side of the aisle. And, I've argued that even when you're actually dealing with devils, that you have to negotiate as part of an ineliminable part of pursuing transitional justice, because often you won't end conflict or get peace without doing that. But I think a third reason that underpins why shaking hands is important is one that's relevant for the conversation here, and that's about the ways in which to refuse to do so reflects a lack of what I call epistemic humility, reflects a lack of recognition of the ways in which we're not well positioned in deeply divided contexts to make judgments about character as opposed to judgments about the wrongfulness of action. And so I'll just say a few more minutes of things about why that judgment of character and the conditions needed to be able to do that accurately are absent in deeply divided communities where you find precisely contempt to be pervasive and judgments about character prominent and prevalent. So a way into this is through Mark Howard Ross's idea of psychocultural dramas, where he's interested in understanding why it is in deeply divided communities you have these really intense conflicts over things like parades, or in the United States over kneeling for the national anthem. And his explanation for why this is so is because of the ways in which these, from the outside, insignificant or what's the big deal sort of things, touch the deepest fears that drive conflict. And they do so because of how they are bound up with group narrative self-understanding. So, individuals and groups always think of ourselves in terms of narratives, our understanding of our past and how that shapes our present, and how that is reflective of our values and our character and our hopes and fears for the future in ways that are emotionally powerful. And importantly for Ross, we draw on the past as sort of lessons for how we ought to act in the present and future, and use it to shape our expectations about how the others, and in particular others we're in conflict with, will respond to us. So it shapes expectations for the treatment we'll get from members of other groups, and our fears about survival or extinction or humiliation or loss of power in ways that are relational. And where in deeply divided contexts, you have often these expectations and fears based on very stereotypical representations of the other community. So just returning to parades, in Northern Ireland, when you have, parading season always sparked violence during the summer because Unionists wanted to march through Catholic neighborhoods celebrating Protestant domination over Catholics in historic battles. And for Catholics, nationalists that evoked histories of segregation and discrimination, and sort of reflected aspirations to return to that in the present against a background of imperfect equality being realized anyway. And Unionists, in the desire to silence that, what they think of as cultural expression, fears of what will happen to Unionist identity if Ireland is ever to be reunited, against the background of a peace agreement that makes that a constitutional possibility. In the US, you've got these parades that, so Colin Kaepernick was the NFL football player who was most prominent here, who was essentially blacklisted by the NFL and lost his career, despite from the metrics of performance being one of the top quarterbacks because of his kneeling during the national anthem, then President Trump commenting on it. And for Republicans who are overwhelmingly white, this evokes deep fears about the future place of white men and women in the US as the majority approaches the minority status demographically, and what this will mean for loss of power and privilege among white Americans. And for Democrats who are more a multiracial and disproportionately party that represents men and women of color in the US, the backlash and response evoked fears of the presence, the ongoing presence, and indeed aspiration to re-entrench even further racial injustice, and of the historic evocation of backlash against anyone, and in particular Black men and women, who contested white supremacy in the context of the US. So fears evoked by this seemingly insignificant, absent the context, act. So just by way of concluding, what I think this means in sort of turning to Mason and her view of contempt is that her assessment of the ease with which victims and others can hold in permanent contempt Nazis like Stangl presupposes a context in which we're well positioned to draw inferences from action to character. And I think that kind of inference is not easy to make in the context of deeply divided politics, where you have stereotypical characterizations of members of other groups, and is antithetical to the work that's been done on collaborators and bystanders and perpetrators, where there are a wide range of circumstances and a wide range of reasons that explain why terrible things are done by perpetrators and people. So, citing Mark Drumble's work on child soldiers and indeed Juan's work in the book edited volume he helped co-edit on collaborators. So I'll stop there.
I just want to point out that Colleen's book on transitional justice, The Conceptual Foundations of Transitional Justice, has a lot of really interesting conceptual insights beyond these, but these are great, and the studies of the cases you just did are really fascinating. Thank you. All right, so it's time for discussion, and I thought we might take questions in pairs. So we have a lot of people who have come through a lot of Mexico City traffic to be here in person. We can take maybe a question from here in person and then one from Zoom. So if you on Zoom want to raise a hand, anyone in person? Anyone in audience? Or yes, you. And anyone on Zoom, raise a hand. Don't see any. So let's have two in person. Por favor. And we just have to get the microphone over to folks. There we go. Y se puede decir en su nombre. Sí.
Hello, my name is Jessica Vargas, and my question is actually for Professor Colleen Murphy. So I totally agree about the importance of engaging and compromising, and about how contempt might make compromising difficult, particularly in the kind of situations that we're discussing, no? Transitional justice situations or very polarized societies. And I also understand sort of how the epistemic conditions may make very easy to get contempt wrong, but there are still cases in which contempt might be fitting. And I wonder if rejecting contempt, sort of an overall rejection of contempt, in a sense, is in a case of the conflation problem, in which even a fitting emotion is being rejected, basically because of the consequences that it might sort of bring most of the time or often. And I wonder if rather than rejecting contempt, a sort of an alternative approach could be that we should engage and we should compromise even when we feel contempt or when we experience contempt. and sort of address the question of the sort of the challenge that implies that we feel contempt, we experience contempt. Of course, we need to emphasize how often that contempt might be not fitting, unfitting, but still, yeah, engaging, I mean, sort of emphasizing the idea that transitional justice problems is going to involve a sort of commitment to compromise and to engage even with those for whom we feel contempt. And it might be the case that even the contempt is fitting in some of those situations. So yeah, that was sort of my question. Why sort of connecting the difficulties with a sort of an overall rejection of contempt?
Good. No, that's super helpful. So I'll
Can we
say,
just have a second and take Pablo's
oh
question?
yeah, you want to take two? Sorry. Okay.
Pablo. Thank you. Thank you, Colleen.
Thanks, Tom. So I have a question for Juan, which is nice. And I really like, so that I was recently listening to some radio show about the whole social platform liabilities, and apparently their typical argument is we're not responsible for what users do with our platform, responsibilities in users. And you want to articulate an account, one of the implications of which would be to sort of dismiss this counter argument, this rejoinder. And I like what you said about platforms being realms of manipulation. I wasn't very clear or didn't quite get how or in what sense they generate content, but it is clear to me that they amplify certain contents, and they can amplify toxic speech, as you say. They can contribute to exacerbate violence, and in this way, they're relevant actors can be relevant actors in transitional justice context. I was reminded of the famous case of the radio host in Rwanda, and it might be interesting to explore analogies and contrast. But I was a bit, let's say, thinking about transitional justice tools for something like what you're trying to think about, and I wonder why you, or maybe you haven't thought about it, but not meaning I don't know if there's a reason, but punitive damages would be a way of, or let me put it differently. I think criminal lawyers would be a bit skeptical of the possibility of making someone liable in criminal law for foreseeability. You have to have something stronger like recklessness or some, if you don't have mens rea in criminal law, it's hard to make someone liable. You don't have that problem if you go with punitive damages charged on the corporation. And they're so wealthy that you could, presumably fund a victim's fund for, reparations on the basis of these punitive damages. But I'm not sure that you can get to individual criminal liability, or that you need to. I'm not sure, but it's interesting to see, to what extent you can make someone liable for what an artificial intelligence algorithm does. And I can see that there's a really interesting question there. But I would say criminal lawyers would be skeptical of meeting the high standards of criminal liability.
Thank you, Pablo. Colleen, want to respond to Jessica's question?
Yeah, no, Jessica, that's a great question. I'll say three quick things. One is that just by way of clarification, so I don't want to wholeheartedly say there are no conditions under which contempt could be justified or fitting. I just think those conditions are going to be extremely rare because of the extent of the information that you're going to have to be able to get in the context that I'm interested in for contempt that's politically focused to be sufficiently confident that it's fitting. So, and again, I'm talking about kind of politically oriented contempt. I'm not talking about contempt in the context of marriages or other spaces or relationships in which the kind of knowledge of the person might be more readily there. Second thing is just a contextualization of, in particular, I'm worried about contempt in in transitional contexts where you've got these deeply divided communities for whom there are simply incommensurable narratives of conflict and division, and where so much of the discourse is about how bad the people on the other side are, right? We're good folks, we're decent folks, we're good people, and we're just unfortunately in community with bad people. So it's part of the motivation is forget about who people are, forget about judgments about that. And it's not that I think that there are no reactive attitudes that are appropriate, I want to shift the focus to anger and resentment and other sorts of reactive attitudes that are focused on the wrongfulness of the treatment to which someone was subject and protesting that, as opposed to focused fundamentally on the will of the wrongdoer and what is taken to be reflected or revealed by the wrongful act itself. But, terrific question.
Juan. Just passing the microphone.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's also a great question. I also have three quick reactions. And the first one is, the Rwanda case is very interesting because, in fact, that's one of the paradigmatic cases of a criminal trial that's relevant for transitional justice that involved a technology company. I'm not sure that radio broadcaster was a technological firm, but there are important analogies and disanalogies. And one of these analogies is that in that case, the broadcasters did have the intention to promote hateful and speech and propaganda, right? So that's a very big difference. So in the case of Facebook, of course, they don't want to do that. We can believe that they don't. We can believe at least that we can't believe them. So that's one point. So that's it is there's a disanalogy there. But the more important point is that I think that you're right, that in the presentation, and I conflated a little bit legal responsibility and moral responsibility. I'm more concerned about moral responsibility. And so I think that in that case, I don't really have to so I don't have to really make a lot of effort to show that they could have foreseen it, right? In the sense that I think that their actions were reckless in the sense that they know that their algorithms are promoting hateful content. So they know that, and they can do that because they use targeted advertisement, right? Mm-hmm. So I could say, well, if you know that your tool targeted advertisement ends up promoting hateful content, then I think you're responsible for hateful content being promoted, right? Morally, at least. Maybe that doesn't give rise to legal responsibility, but I think the claim I'm trying to make is that your algorithms are having that effect, and you allegedly don't have a way to sort of like avoid that undesirable outcome, and that outcome is pretty bad. Okay. Then you're responsible for not. But one could argue that you should refrain from using that tool, right? That algorithm. And so I think you can ground a moral, you can ground a claim about moral responsibility. But you're right that legal responsibility is more tricky. So I don't know if I'm responding to. And then just and then the third point I want to make is that you're right that questions about who's responsible for the algorithm the challenges that it raises are fantastic, and they have the many hands problem, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of hands involved in making the algorithm, and how do you distribute that kind of responsibility? That's a question that I'm getting into, so I'm not going to be able to give you a good answer, but I'm aware that those problems exist. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Juan. I see we have a question from Ashwini. Does anyone else in person want to ask a question as well?
I have a question.
Yes, we can take. So let's take Ashwini and anyone else besides Juan. No, Ashwini and Juan. Ashwini, you're muted.
It's been like 2 years and I still keep doing this. So I have two quick questions for Colleen and Juan. So Colleen, this is a follow-up on Jessica's question. So I was also struck by what seemed to be the view that if I have contempt for someone, I wouldn't shake their hand and make the kinds of settlements that I know I have to. So I wondered whether it matters who shows contempt, right? So it might be that we think political negotiators, political decision makers, like contempt really isn't an option for them. But maybe it's okay for your everyday citizen to continue to be contemptuous of people on the other side, right? And they might even be contemptuous of the settlement, right? So they might say, that person was the devil. Somebody had to shake his hand, but I continue to be contemptuous of him. And whether that at least responds to some of the concerns, like the more pragmatic concerns, right? So it maybe some people get to show contempt and feel contempt, but political actors, maybe our analysis is different there. And then with Juan, I also had a similar thought to Pablo. So I think there's something really intriguing about the view that the platforms are co-creators. And so I wondered whether this would be a resource for you. So the literature that really looks at speech and thinks that the medium really matters to what the message is, and that you can't really take those two things apart. So when I say something to a person, the fact that I'm now saying something on a public Facebook post just changes what that content is. And so that's a different way in which a platform might be contributing to the content if we simply think that content is never independent of its medium of expression. And then I had all of these like really tedious philosophical questions that are sort of pointless hypotheticals that I don't think really have anything to do with your project, but I'll email you about those scenarios later on. Thank you.
Thank you. Juan, question for Colleen?
Yeah, so this is more not so much a question, more like sort of, I guess, an observation. And is that when I read your paper and I heard you now, I thought, I don't know if you know this book by William Miller, The Anatomy of Disgust, because I think it's really along the same lines of your project. And he discusses there the figure of the moral menial, if I remember correctly. But it's basically the person who does he does a menial job in the sense that it's a job that people reject and don't like, but that has to be done. And then he talks about moral millions because, I mean, this work is dirty because it's morally compromising, it's morally objectionable. And so he discusses that figure and ties it up with the view of disgust. So I think it would be really helpful. I used it. I mean, now shameless self-promotion since Tom was kind enough to mention my book. Because I try to do something along the lines of what you're doing. Of course, you're doing it much better than I did, and I didn't really develop it philosophically like you're doing. But what I was trying to do when I thought about Stasi collaborators and studying the public outcry about them was to say that just people were judging them on their character, that they were weak, or that they were secretive, or that they were just tons of negative adjectives, but that people really didn't know what they had been going through, because the conditions were so different back then in the DDR and that they were in contemporary Germany, and that if people took people who were criticizing collaborators just took news articles about them and what these news articles were citing about their engagement with the secret police, but this came from the archive, and the archive was very, very incomplete, and they were not getting the whole thing from the archive, just they were pulling things out of context. So because of all of those kinds of things, people really did not have the information, so the epistemic conditions of to make a judgment on character. And so I'm really sympathetic to the project you're doing, and I think that in effect, I think it hasn't been philosophically probed. So I'm really looking forward to reading your full paper. So that's my observation.
Thanks, Juan. Colleen, would you like to respond, and then Juan to Ashwini?
Sure. So first, Juan, thanks for the recommendation. And it's kind of in thinking. So what's nice about the example you were giving too, which I appreciate, is it's different from the sort of the source of the problem is different than the sort of incommensurable narratives among communities in conflict, but it's still getting at the problems from having a little bit of information, what you can, what kind of inferences you can draw. So thanks thank you for that too. And so, Ashwini, I just say, so I think that you're right, and I can add develop more nuance on the, does it depend who we're talking about has contempt as to the problems that are created by it? I don't think it'll be, though, an elite or leader versus ordinary citizen divide, because part of the work in transitional justice has been looking at how so many efforts fail if you get only an agreement among the elite or leaders. So there's, movements for grassroots peace building and transitional justice that's more localized because of the way you need more buy-in and more commitment on the part of ordinary citizens if you're actually going to have efforts succeed. So that wouldn't be the cut I would make, though I'm open to, more. So Juan was generous in the sophistication, but there's a lot more nuance that I need to build in specifying it's not sort of under no conditions could it be justified. I just think there'll be very few. And then the positionality, and think through what kind of positionality will matter for when you're more likely to be in a rare position to have conditions for contempt to be properly focused. Yeah. Thanks. That was super helpful feedback from everyone.
Fun.
Yeah, so hi, Ashwin, thanks for those comments. I think that
Just fixing the mic.
okay. So I was saying that's those are great comments. That's very helpful, Ashwini. The idea that you cannot separate the medium from the content. So it matters how you convey the message. So I think I totally agree. I might have been a bit liberal with my use of the verb create and creation, saying that the platforms are co-creators, but I don't think I'm exaggerating too much, because so if you take, for instance, the fact of anonymity, right, which is, by the way, something that platforms are trying to change. Mm-hmm. But if you think about the golden years of Facebook or Twitter, where you could be anonymous. I mean, again, you can still be anonymous to some extent, but that's changing. But that's kind of like, and perhaps this is what you're getting to. I mean, if you invite someone to say things without having to give face, without having to damage their reputation, because people can damage their own reputation when they say stupid things, yeah. Then you're kind of inviting that person to say terrible things, right? And so that's just one example of what I have in mind when I say that the platforms are co-creators of speech. I mean, they're just enticing people to say things in such a way that it will benefit them, right? And so so that's what I have in mind. So that's very useful. And send me, please, the other thoughts you have. I'm really looking forward to reading them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to everybody. And I think we've reached the time where we should take our break. So let's take 7 minutes from 10 past the hour, just so everybody can refresh themselves. And then we'll start up again with Pablo and Isabel. Thank you very much, Juan and Colleen, for great talks, great discussion. We'll see you in 7 minutes.
Okay.
Hi, Josh. They're not recording, so I can say hi. I know that everybody.
Yeah, I was going to say let's chit chat, but
yes,
we're up on a screen in the Philosophicas.
I'm just gonna get some tea, but it's great to see.
I have to go home. I'm going to log back on from home, but I've got to go relieve the sitter right now.
Okay.
Ciao.
Take care.
Bye.
Gracias. Good. All right. So, welcome back, everyone. We're now going to take our next two papers. And Colleen, can you hear me okay? Yes, great.
Yep, can you hear just great?
Wonderful. So we're going to start with Pablo Kalmanovitz, who is, as I said, professor at the Autonomous Technological Institute of Mexico and the author of the Laws of War in International Thought, which you have right here. So Pablo, will you want to take it away? And I'll try to share your PowerPoint.
Okay, sure go. So thanks, Tom, for organizing, for bringing us here, and thank you, Juan, for hosting us. So I want to sort of give some very tentative thoughts on this idea or this possibility of doing transitional justice in context of organized criminal violence. And I want to start by giving you some context on this question. If you want to do next, please. So I'm interested in thinking about these new practices of collective violence in Latin America, which are associated to global illicit markets, mainly drug trafficking organizations with armed capabilities that can outmatch police forces. States have declared war on drugs or wars on organized crime in a host of countries in Latin America, in Colombia, here in Mexico, in Peru, Salvador, Brazil. And there have also been turf wars, so-called turf wars among criminal organizations which fight for control of illicit markets and territories. The intensity of violence and the humanitarian costs of these forms of organized criminal violence have been at the level of armed conflict. Homicide rates, the forms of displacement, I'll talk about this shortly. Even in some cases, they have been treated as armed conflicts, such as Peru, Colombia, Mexico, not quite, El Salvador almost. So these situations of large-scale organized violence look very similar to wars, and hence the sort of question of to what extent we can think about them as cases of transitional justice from war to peace, which is sort of a standard case of transitional justice. And here's a sample of Mexico, just to give you a sense, and similar slides could be made for Colombia, Salvador, Brazil. But Mexico is pretty bad. Between 2006 and 2020, according to some measures, there have been 260,000 violent deaths related or as a consequence of the war on drugs. There's a peak of lethal violence used by the Mexican army in 2011, and the army itself reported over 1,400 killings of so-called aggressors in over 1,000 clashes or something like battles. That year, 52,000 troops were deployed in the streets, well, not quite the streets, but were out there fighting criminal organizations. Same period, over 350,000 individuals were forcibly displaced, and they remain displaced. And in 2022, this is just numbers that sort of give you a sense of the scale of collective violence. The official registry of enforced disappearance reached over 95,000 people. I think it's over 100 now. And 98% of those were reported disappear after 2006. And 2006 is very important because that's the year when President Calderon declared the war on drugs. So the dismal figures are comparable to cases of armed conflict. And hence the question, okay, so is transitional justice a fitting response for this kind of organized violence? So I'm going to speak mainly about the first question, whether we can speak sort of meaningfully or in what sense we can speak of transitional justice in this type of context. There's another question, which is whether we should speak of transitional justice in this context, but I'm not going to talk about that one, but happy to hear your thoughts about that. I'm not clear on that one. And I'm going to do it in 3 steps. The first is to argue that militarized criminal organizations should be seen actually as political actors. They are political actors. Then on the basis of that conception of these organizations as political actors, I would suggest that there are two dimensions of transitional justice that we can distinguish. They're related, but there are two ways in which we can meaningfully speak of transitional justice in this context, and then discuss to conclude some thoughts on certain distinctive potential constraints and compromises which are characteristic of transitional justice in context of organized criminal violence. So I'm going to argue for the political nature of these criminal organizations in two tables. So the first, just this, and it's very useful to do a comparison with insurgencies, which are sort of a standard case of transitional justice. And here I would like to emphasize the differences. So insurgencies, their goal is to capture the state center, to exclude the state from certain territorial enclaves. They engage in what Calivas called some years ago competitive state building. They create forms of rebel governance that are the goal of which is to be stable and to earn a certain legitimacy in their territories. Criminal organizations, by contrast, prefer to co-opt state authorities and to operate jointly in territorial enclaves. So they don't want to displace the state, they want to co-opt, bribe, in some cases threaten, but really co-opt and bribe is the preferred modus operandi. And their goal is to achieve some sort of peaceful modus vivendi with state authorities to such that state authorities would allow them to do their illicit business, and the criminal organizations will also profit from some functions of the state, such as the police, informants from the police, bribe judges to attack their enemies, etc. So big contrast between these two. Also, the way they use violence is very different, even though, so the nature, the strategic nature of their use of violence is different, but the impact can be comparable. And the strategic nature is different because insurgencies are by constitution directed against state forces. So whenever it's tactically feasible, whenever it's advantageous, they will attack state forces. And they tend to, or they would want to display their armed capabilities publicly because they are warriors. Criminal organizations, by contrast, prefer to bribe and to co-opt state authorities rather than attack them. They have to attack them, they do, but the most efficient business-like procedure is to bribe, and they use force only in response to law enforcement when they're attacked by state forces, or they use force when they compete among themselves. But the use of force is very different. Now, nonetheless, I want to argue that both insurgencies and criminal organizations have both political and economic goals. And in this sense, criminal organizations are political. So again, the contrast. Insurgencies want to gain territorial control because that's a strategic military goal. They want to outcompete state authorities in the territories that they're interested politically to control. And they tend to cultivate local legitimacy or bases sociales. Insurgencies tend to repudiate electoral politics. They treat state authorities as political enemies. Now, by contrast, criminal organizations, they also try to have territorial control, but the goal of territorial control is not, it's not a military goal, is to facilitate the production and traffic of illicit substances. They tend to co-opt, if they can, state authorities. And local legitimacy may be efficient. They may try to earn some sort of communal approval. They may provide some social goods, but it's an instrument for a more efficient conduct of their business. They're known to influence electoral politics. They fund political campaigns, and they co-opt, as I said several times already, they tend to co-opt state law enforcement officials. So they are political in the sense that they're interested in power, they're interested in territorial control, but they're interested for very different reasons than insurgencies are. Economic goals, both have them. Insurgencies have an interest in funding the revolution, and they often do that by producing illicit revenues, taxing illicit substances, drug trafficking, etc. But they do relatively little investment in the legal economy or in legal politics. They don't do extensive money laundering, etc. Criminal organizations, by contrast, tend to, the goal of their enterprise is to get illicit revenues. It's not an instrument for anything else, it's just the objective. They do vast money laundering schemes in the legal economy, and they invest in electoral politics. So in sum, both are insurgencies and criminal organizations. They are both political and economic actors. Their political goals are very different, but I think it's very important to treat criminal organizations, or to see very clearly the political dimension of criminal organizations. Next, please. Sorry, I forgot that. So two ways of understanding or conceiving of transitional justice in this context. The first is thinking of something like a regime transition, a political transition. And this would be a transition from a crime-infiltrated political regime, which lacks the monopoly of force on its territory, to a regime that's purged of large-scale corruption and which has effective monopoly over legitimate force. So the Bavarian state is sort of a goal, and corruption becomes under control. And the second dimension is human rights violations on a vast scale, which require extraordinary mechanisms such as those typically associated with transitional justice. So reparation programs for victims, and there are many, search for disappeared persons, again, same, there are many, resettlement programs for IDPs, for displaced persons, etc. Criminal accountability for human rights violations and potentially for international crimes, as in transitions from war to peace. Truth commissions to investigate wrongdoing, particular links between state authorities and criminal groups, and maybe more important in this context than in sort of standard context, purges and disqualification of corrupt state agents. So this is what I have in mind when I think about transitional justice in this context. Now, turning to, and I'm almost done, to constraints and compromises, I would say the main constraint here is, so this is the analogy of why would insurgents negotiate peace if they're going to go to jail or face some really harsh sentences? What are the incentives? So in this case, the question is, why would members of criminal organizations give up their business and enter transitional justice processes? What incentives could state authorities offer? And here the big constraint, the realist constraint, if you will, is that for as long as illicit substances remain in high demand, there will be groups interested in profiting from illicit markets. There will be drug trafficking and more. So the ideal may be legalizing illicit substances, regulating internationally illicit markets, but this is not attainable at this moment. So the second best is to tolerate, I would argue, illicit markets. And by tolerating, I mean making them peaceful. So the goal of transitional justice in this context, one could argue, I think I would argue, is pacification of these illicit markets. And here, a very important empirical observation is illicit markets can operate peacefully. They're known to operate peacefully in many places. Italy right now, mostly. In Mexico, before in the 19th, between the 70s and 90s, it was quite peaceful. The goal of peace negotiations with criminal organizations then would be characterized by a political bargain in which lenient criminal treatment, potentially legalization of some illegal assets, that would be offered in exchange for contribution to transitional justice, a commitment to disbanding coercive structures, and to surrendering weaponry. The regime transition then would be focused around, I would say, there will be two very important dimensions. One is to purge the state from corrupt authorities, officers, etc., and to disqualify politicians who were funded by crime. And the second is to change counter-narcotics policy. And instead of doing some sort of militarized or quasi-militarized approach, focus on interdiction, financial crimes, corruption, and basically tolerate, not use force against drug traffickers who do not use force. If they use force, then that's something else. But you can't have drug trafficking without violence, and that's sort of a key empirical observation here. So there may be a distinctive transitional justice dilemma in these cases, which is you cannot have both peace and full law enforcement, meaning you cannot pursue the illegality of these illegal markets with the full strength of the law and have peace simultaneously. So if you want peace, you have to sacrifice some law enforcement. And that's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pablo. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Isabel and try to share Isabel's PowerPoint here. If it works for me there. Yeah. Does that?
Okay.
Oh, we have different screens going,
Yeah.
sorry. That's what's going on. See, my computer is going slowly. Good thing between them. Let's try it again. All right. How about that? Okay.
Yeah, could you please go to the first slide?
Yes,
Thank you.
Isabel, thank you.
So thank you so much for inviting me. And I would like to thank Juan and Tom for inviting me to join this panel. For me, it's a pleasure to learn from your work as well. I am Isabel Luisa Gomez, a PhD candidate in political science and peace studies at the University of Notre Dame in the United States, and a doctoral affiliate to the Notre Dame Violence and Transitional Justice Lab. And today I would like to talk about making peace and justice in political and criminal violence contexts by focusing on the Colombian case. And here I am drawing ideas that we have developed with my co-author, Rodrigo Primni, for a collaborative volume that is edited by Juan and Monica Serrano. And we started thinking about these questions for Mexico, reflecting upon the Colombian case. Now, I think that sadly, we are also thinking about these questions for Colombia itself, because we are seeing renewed forms of violence happening in Colombia that also calls into question what Paulo was raising in his presentation about whether transitional justice is a fitting response to organized crime settings. And in the case of Colombia, it's political and criminal violence contexts. So basically, the ideas that I would like to put forth here is that renewed forms of large-scale violence have pushed the boundaries of transitional justice in the last decades. So conventionally, we think about peacemaking and transitional justice as deeply associated with political transitions, from either authoritarian rule or civil war to liberal democracy. But in the last decades and in many contexts, and I'm gonna give some examples from Latin American countries, we have seen emerging strategies of making peace and justice in contexts of organized crime, which basically call into question this relationship between transitional justice and peacemaking and transitional justice mechanisms and political transitions. So some cases, for instance, governments have negotiated with neighborhood gangs seeking to reduce violence, and these agreements have taken different forms like non-aggression agreements, truces, or seemingly peace agreements. And a case in point is 2012 El Salvador, where the national government struck agreements with the MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs, reducing homicide rates by 50% in a year, according to Cruz and Duran Martinez. In other instances, governments are seeking to negotiate with organized criminal groups in contexts marked by both political and criminal violence, blurring the lines between the criminal violence world and the political violence world. So that's the case of Colombia, I think, right now, where the Petro administration has endorsed the Total Peace Policy, or Paz Total, which basically seeks not only to implement the 2016 peace agreement, but also to negotiate with the ELN, which is the last guerrilla group still in arms in Colombia, but also with organized criminal groups and structures in Colombia. So by analyzing the Colombia case, I would like to show that this notion, or this conventional notion of transitional justice and peacemaking as associated with political transitions, falls short in capturing the determinants of large-scale violence in contexts of organized crime, but also the prospects for peace. And here I am echoing some arguments that Paulo has made in his paper, but also other work from Latin American countries by Guillermo Trejo and Sandra Ley, where they showed how organized criminal groups are distinct from insurgents or paramilitary groups in contexts like, for instance, in Colombia, that aside from challenging state sovereignty to access state power, criminal groups are more interested in profiting from illicit markets, and they may confront the state to coerce law enforcement, but basically to secure revenues from illicit markets. That is not to say that they are not political actors. Indeed, they are. Many of these groups flourish under the so-called gray zone of criminality, where state officials and state armed forces collude. They grant these groups with protection and allow them to run illicit business and exert territorial control. So in that sense, I would like to develop this idea that perhaps we can think about a more conceptually bounded approach to peacemaking and transitional justice as extraordinary mechanisms that can help us envision well-suited strategies to pursue peace and justice in organized criminal settings without thinking that they derive from or seek to boost a political transition necessarily. So here I'm going to make reference to some examples in the Colombian case, and I think that is a really good case to think about these questions. Colombia has been home to the longest running civil war in the Western Hemisphere and also enduring organized crime. So we can see two different worlds in Colombia that are distinct from one another, but also overlap in many instances. On one hand, we had several regular groups, paramilitary groups, and state armed forces that waged an insurgent and counterinsurgent war, where basically guerrilla groups sought to access state power and exert territorial control, and paramilitary groups, either on their own or in collusion with state armed forces, intended to curb rebellion and shield elites' political power and wealth. On the other hand, we have the so-called criminal violence world, where organized crime structures such as drug cartels from the 1980s and neighborhood gangs and subnational organized criminal groups more recently pursue profit from involvement in illicit markets and to coerce or influence law enforcement to secure revenues. And although these are different worlds, they have overlapped in many instances. Recently in Colombia, we have seen how some criminal groups are waving a political banner, perhaps signaling the government that they are also political actors, that they can negotiate with the government. In the internal armed conflict, also guerrilla groups and paramilitary groups were involved in drug trafficking, but they did not abandon the insurgent or counterinsurgent agenda that they had. Even though we have many overlaps between these worlds, the government has pursued different strategies to address violence from these different sources. So peacemaking and transitional justice has been mainly used as a key strategy to end violence and to negotiate with insurgent groups and paramilitary groups, whereas ordinary mechanisms such as the surrender policy has been used to dismantle organized criminal groups. From peacemaking and transitional justice, we have many examples in Colombia. In the last 1980s and early 1990s, the government signed up several peace agreements with guerrilla groups, and then the 2016 peace agreement with the FARC-EP that not only deals with disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, ceasefire, and transitional justice mechanism, but also it includes other mechanisms aimed at addressing underlying sources to conflict, such as land inequality or political exclusion. Also, with paramilitaries, the government initially had closed doors negotiation with them. It was a heated debate in Colombia whether that negotiation could be regarded as a peace process because paramilitary groups were colluding with state officials and state armed forces. But eventually, due to sustained victims mobilization, we had some trials and reparation mechanisms to redress wrongdoing of paramilitary groups. More recently, the government is thinking about this strategy of paz total or total peace. And here I would like to talk more about the renewed forms of violence that we are seeing in Colombia. So since the signing of the peace agreement, we have seen increases in lethal violence against grassroots leaders and ex-combatants in the post-accord area who were promoting many programs that were envisioned in the 2016 peace agreement. So here we see a spike in violence since 2016 when the agreement was signed. Next slide, please. In other municipalities, this is a table that basically lays out homicide rates for municipalities in Colombia that witnessed high violence in the worst years of the civil war in Colombia. Now those places are again witnessing violence and homicidal violence that is mainly committed by organized criminal groups. So if you can see in the first rows, homicide rates are incredibly high. And these figures are for 2020. So in this new area and in the post-accord era, what we are seeing is that there is still a guerrilla group still in arms, which is the ELN, and other splinter factions from FARC demobilization, which resemble more organized criminal groups and other subnational organized criminal groups. And the government is seeking to negotiate with all of them. And it raises question about transitional justice and peacemaking, if they can be used as mechanisms or extraordinary mechanisms to deal with this kind of violence and to prevent violence from continue to relapse in Colombia. And next slide, please. I won't address the question of whether peacemaking is a really good, or peace negotiation is a good strategy to deal with organized criminal groups, because it has happened on the ground, not only in Colombia, but also in other cases where governments have led a closed door negotiation with these groups. I think that the key debate right now should be on the extent to which governments can negotiate with these groups and what sort of issues negotiations should include. So here I have some open questions that we can talk more about in the Q&A round. The first question I think that we should think about creatively is how should governments negotiate with criminal groups depending on their military might and degrees of involvement in illicit markets, because we have groups that are outsourcing violence versus groups who control illicit markets. So depending on the military structure that they have, it is key for governments to think about what type of agreements they can have from those groups and what kind of compliance they can have from those groups. A second important question, I think, is how should governments approach negotiation with organized criminal structures enlisting state officials, such as state armed forces, mayors, and judges? Because I think that this approach to organized criminal actors and violence, that there is a zero-sum relationship between the state and the criminal world, does not hold on the ground. On the ground, what we see is that these groups flourish because they are protecting from state officials. They can run illicit business. So the key question is how we can assure negotiation with many state officials are involved in organized criminal structures. A key question that Paulo already raised is what kind of incentives can governments offer to criminals to assure compliance and demobilization? If they are mainly interested in profiting from illicit markets, and it is beyond the scope of governments to regulate drug trafficking or even illicit mining or extortion, what kind of incentives we can offer to them to assure that it's not aggression pacts, but it's more a sort of transitional justice mechanism that can guarantee us any sort of sustainable peace. There are other questions that were not addressed before, but I think that right now we have clear answers to them. For instance, victims' rights and participation. Those issues were not key at bargaining tables between governments and organized criminal groups. First of all, because these negotiations were not public, they were overt negotiations, so there was no public oversight. But second, because at least for the Colombian case and also at the international level, we have clearer standards for states to satisfy victims' rights. So these kind of agreements cannot deny any sort of victims' rights at this point. And I think that there are other questions that we don't necessarily take seriously for this context, but that are key for assuring a sustainable peace. And those questions are related to more forward-reaching reforms, such as security sector reform or electoral reform. And I would like to talk briefly about security sector reform, because I think that this is a key issue for most transitioning and post-transitional contexts. Think about the Mexican context, or El Salvador, or Guatemala, where there was a political transition. In some cases, it was any sort of police reform for Central American countries, but it was ill implemented. And as a consequence, many experts in violence deflected to state armed forces, and then they became key actors in organized criminal groups. And in the Colombian case, even though we have had many experiences with transitional justice and peacemaking, we have not implemented seriously a security sector reform. And perhaps it might explain why we are seeing increases in organized criminal violence and how we should think more about transitional justice mechanisms and how they are linked with security sector reform or these other more far-reaching reforms. So briefly with these questions, what I would like to invite us to think about is how we can conceive of peacemaking or transitional justice as extraordinary mechanisms that could be well equipped to dealing with these kind of questions and atrocities in organized criminal settings, but not necessarily need to be related to political transitions. Because when we are thinking and when we are obsessed with political transitions, we are missing the big picture and how these mechanisms have proven to be really useful to decrease violence in other contexts, regardless of any sort of regime change or war to peace transition. And I will leave it here. We can talk more about this later.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Isabel. Really interesting. And again, shifting away from the sort of the centered on the well-resourced state to looking at the micro processes. I appreciate that. So let's take some questions and have some discussion. Folks on Zoom, feel free to raise a hand. And are there questions? I see Fabiola has one, and Paul and Paulina, and then yes, Diana. Okay, so let's take Fabiola and Paulina, and then we'll do another round. Fabiola, and we need the microphone. Can you pass the microphone?
Well, thank you. I don't know the literature on transitional justice, okay? So sorry about that, but I'm gonna ask anyway, because I'm surprised. Well, I want to press. I'm surprised that criminal organizations can be treated within with the framework of transitional justice. Yeah. And Pablo, I'm going to ask you directly. I know that Isabel talked about, I mean, there's a lot of overlap, but I'm going to ask you. And when you, first, when you gave the account of criminal organizations as political actors, you didn't mention, or I missed it, that one of the tactics they use is to terrorize the civil population to exert control. And that may be an important difference with some rebel groups, with some of them at least. And the way you presented them is as if they prefer to proceed through bribery, co-opting authorities, and this underestimates or underplays the extent of violence that they exert, in particular towards defenseless population, terrorizing them, right? And so that's just one point. But my question really is about, I mean, why frame the negotiations that the government has to engage in order to promote peace? Why frame this as transitional justice? Because these actors, I think you want to say they are political actors in order to bring them under the umbrella of transitional justice. That was my impression. I may be wrong. But then when you do that, then the approach to them is not as just criminals that ought to be punished. So the reason why the government doesn't punish them is not because there you have a strongly divided population where both sides may have some legitimacy in view of their constituencies, but you have a scenario in which the government or the state is just not powerful enough to punish criminals that the population believes. There's no division about it. The population believes they ought to be punished because they are criminals. I mean, they exert all this violence in order to profit from illicit markets or illicit products or whatever, right? And so I don't understand, I mean, how this, given that they are criminals and there's agreement that they ought to be punished, but the state doesn't have the resources to do so, why frame it as a case of transitional justice? I just don't get it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fabiola. Paulina.
Actually, I want to allow Colleen to go first because my question's sort of getting the conversation a little derailed. So I would like to hear Colleen, and then I'll see if it's pertinent to come back. So you can call me back afterwards.
Okay, Colleen.
Sure, and I'll be short, so maybe even fit in Paulina, so then we'll get all three in. I was curious with both papers, and it was sparked by how, Pablo, you were framing this explicitly in terms of political. So I'm wondering about how you're thinking about what is it that makes either a relationship or an actor political. It's not necessarily the goal. So you were saying it's not necessarily the goal of getting political power or control over territory. I assume it's not merely relating to the state in a certain way or trying to negotiate with the state, because I imagine I was trying to come up with examples and I didn't, because it's the end of the day. But so I wanted to hear more about what is it that makes something political or a group political as opposed to not being.
So let's have responses to those, and then we'll take another round. And you have the mic. Yes.
Thank you for both, really useful. And so, Fabiola, I think your sort of skepticism is what I was suspecting. It's a bit of a, so I'm doing a bit of an exercise in conceptual stretching, but sort of the first time I began thinking about this was with Juan when we were doing this consultancy at CIDE, because there was some mention by AMLO before he took power that he was interested in transitional justice and that we should negotiate with these criminals and do some demobilization program. So that was sort of the first time, and I don't remember how long ago, that was like 5 years, yeah, at least 2018, right? So Mexico didn't follow that path, of course. And now in Colombia, there is language, but they are, Diana and I were recently in a workshop where the head of Congress came to give his sort of version of what's happening now. And he was very emphatic, this is not transitional justice. But it kind of is what they're doing, though. But so I agree that these tactics of terrorization are very important. I didn't mean to sort of discount them or minimize them, by no means. I think a lot of this territorial control that empirical studies of criminal violence have been documenting is very despotical. There's forms of quasi-slavery in poppy seed plantations in Mexico. So that's really, that may actually be a reason for doing transitional justice, which is to recognize the power and to say, if you dismount those armed forms of governance, we are going to be willing to sort of tolerate your business in a way. That's sort of one of the bargains that I'm mentioning. So the goal of transitional justice in this context would be precisely to seize those, to stop those kind of terrorizing practices, to in exchange for criminal organizations dismounting their military apparatuses, let them sort of have their money, some lenient treatment in the criminal law system, and later on be less aggressive. The state will be less aggressive against them in their territories, with the idea that that will sort of also produce milder forms of criminal governance. But it's tricky. But that's meaning your concern for tactics of terrorization, and I would say also despotic governance, is central to a project of doing transitional justice in this context, which is perhaps the main objective would be to dismount those. So why call these negotiations transitional justice? Why not just call them plea bargaining, right? It's just, ordinary criminals. And I think the difference is that they are so powerful. And that's sort of what's happening, perhaps, or that's one way of looking what's happening now, or describing what's happening now in Colombia. And Diana last night sent me the new bill. There's a project of a new law creating a framework for these organizations to submit to justice, someterse a la justicia. And the project is premised on the idea that these are very powerful actors that have territorial control. And as such, we have to be realistic and negotiate with them, starting from the premise, you are very powerful. I recognize your power, let's negotiate. And we're gonna sort of give concessions and you're gonna give up power, basically. So it's kind of a plea bargaining with a very powerful criminal actor. And when you do that kind of plea bargaining, the bargain has to be make more concessions that reflect the power of the actor. And in that way, it starts looking a little bit like political negotiations. But they're not gonna negotiate legislation. They're not gonna legislate, the Constitution as they did in the case of the FARC. They're not an insurgency with an ideological project, with some, legitimacy that, or maybe some division in society that has to be reflected in a bargain that's going to be inclusive and change political practices. That's not the kind of negotiation for sure. But I don't think transitional justice has to be necessarily like that. So I don't think that you need a deeply divided society to do transitional justice. Take the case of Peru. I think Peru, almost everyone was against Shining Path, and still they did a pretty robust truth commission and some reparations. And so it doesn't have to be that you have a divided society to do transitional justice. But you're right that there's a concern, and I think this is the concern that Colleen raised, which is, in what sense am I calling these actors political? And I would say in the sense of, I guess, political realism, meaning they have power, they're interested in power, and they are interested also in influencing state law and state legislation to some extent, to the extent that they have a business interest that they don't want to be, they don't want governments or legislators to interfere with. So their political project is very minimal. It's subordinated to their economic enterprise, which is illegal, but it's an enterprise. But I think that I am calling them political because they are very interested in power and politics, lawful politics. They want to influence politics. And sort of this is looking at it from the perspective of transitional justice. If one doesn't recognize that they are political, then transitional justice mechanisms will fail in getting into the ways they penetrated politics. Yeah. And I think it's important to do that, to sort of, I mean, if you buy my argument that we can call a regime transition this sort of purging and decorrupting, then you have to recognize that kind of ugly, dirty politics.
Thank you. Isabel, did you want to speak to Colleen's political question?
Yes, but before that, I would like to say something and add something to what Paulo has already said regarding your question. And I think that your question raises two issues. The first one is that precisely that's why these kind of settings are a really good case for transitional justice, is because states recognize that they don't have the capacity to prosecute all human rights violations, gross and massive human rights violations. And that's why we are thinking of extraordinary mechanisms to deal with victims' rights and address and satisfy victims' rights. And under such circumstances is why transitional justice is conceived of as an extraordinary mechanism, as a key mechanism. And the second issue that is somehow implicit in your question is that, and I think that for transitional justice in organized criminal settings to happen, we need to think more about other kind of judicial reform and security sector reform, precisely because these actors flourish under the shield of state actors, and state actors are deeply involved in those groups as well. That's why many scholars call them as organized criminal structures rather than organized criminal groups, because there are some structures where you have these non-state actors, but also state actors colluding with them. So the key question here is, how can we put trials in place if we don't have independent autonomous judges or an office of prosecutor, for instance? So I think that is a key question, and there are some examples from other Latin American countries, and I'm thinking about Guatemala and the CICIG, for instance, how this mechanism that was implemented with the help from the UN helped decrease violence and also dismantle organized criminal structures within the Guatemalan state. And I think that we need to take more seriously these kind of questions about state capacity and autonomy from these groups that we don't necessarily think about them regarding insurgent groups, for instance, because we don't see them as colluding with the state officials. And regarding Colleen's question, I think that these groups can be understood as political actors to the extent that they are entangled with the state officials. And that's why they are involved in electoral politics. They are involved in criminal prosecution. That's why they are protecting from any sort of criminal prosecution, and they can run illicit business. And in that sense, they are political actors, not necessarily because they want to access state power in an insurgent fashion that we are more familiar with, but because they are involved in politics. There is no a zero-sum relationship between the state and organized criminal groups. In contrast, we see the flourishing of organized criminal violence in circumstances where these groups are protected by state officials and they run business alongside with state officials.
Wonderful. Thank you, Isabel. So we have, is it Diana? Yes. And then is there anyone else in the room who hasn't asked a question, maybe, who would like to ask one? Then I think we might turn to Paulina, who hasn't asked a question yet. So Diana, then Paulina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talks. So I was wondering, why do you think that the legalization of illicit substances are political unattainable idea for you, Pablo? And for Isabel, if I can do another question, is what do you think about what kind of offers a government like the actual government of Colombia, what kind of offers the government could do to criminal organizations in order to attain the Total Peace Project? That's my questions.
Thank you, Diana. Paulina.
Okay, so I'm still trying to formulate these thoughts, so I hope that they come out clearly. Pablo, you said, like, you finished with this very stark dilemma. I mean, you know, like, either you have a corrupt peace or dirty peace, or something like a righteous war with violence, or like pursue the law but with violence. And so what this led me to think is, I mean, this is a very deep, like, this dilemma is like throwing a bomb. It's like very, very deep because it really gives us no choices. But I was thinking that maybe this has to do with how committed the paradigm of transitional justice is to the idea of peace. And maybe what I thought is that, of course, we think that if there cannot be peace without justice, and there cannot be justice without peace, and it's very entangled, but maybe there shouldn't be. So I'm thinking of my co-author that I'm writing about, like, things that have to do with colonialism and the ideals of the West as imposed in other places, and how the ideal of, my colleague is Murad Idris, and he has written a book about peace and peace as a colonial ideal rather than a general idea for everybody, right? And it's not a universal thought, but one that the state favors a lot and empires particularly favor. And what he proposes instead of peace, which he thinks is colonial and usually leads to more violence, is something like cessation of hostilities. He thinks that the idea of, like, modus vivendi is much more productive than the idea of peace, because peace is uncompromising, it's like love, it's a virtue, it's a Christian virtue, and it never dies, and it's eternal, and it's fundamental, and all of these things. Whereas cessation of hostilities, like it might be dirty, it might be corrupt, it might be like harmed, like it's just a mundane idea, it's a political ideal. Whereas peace is so demanding. And you may have, so I thought that this, again, it's just half-formed ideas here, but I made that connection with Murad's views. And then this is just an anecdote. Once I was sitting with a group of lawyers, and they were like complaining about corrupt Mexican politicians. And I said, like, hold on, like the drugs get sold in the US, right? So why is there no violence in the US? And he said, oh, that's because we have prosecutorial discretion. And it's like, well, that sounds like corruption to me. No, that's legal. So, if you legislate corruption as legal, then you solve the problem, right? It's just a question of making it legal, and then you can have as much corruption as you like. I mean, it's not really corruption, but it's sort of that legislating that tolerance into law. The ability to make deals and let them go and all of that stuff.
Thank you. Let's add Ashwini. Did you have a question?
I did, but I didn't want to just keep asking questions. Do we have time?
Yes, we can take it. Go.
Okay, so this is for Pablo, and I think it's related to this question about the political status of actors. So I think one, we could just say that there are sometimes large entities that are state-like. So I think a really good example is like the Dutch and British East Indies Company that basically colonized and then sort of after the fact became part of the British Empire, right? So I think, so there might not be this big difference, I think, in some ways between the two. But I really wanted to push on the idea that you need to have a political actor, right? So is that a conceptual element of transitional justice, or is it just contingently the case that the kinds of entities that are capable of large-scale violence, that are so powerful that you need to negotiate a settlement with, that will end up invariably having sort of large institutional, societal impact, and where we think many individuals are sort of connected or complicit in different ways, even if they're not directly culpable. It just so happens that that often ends up being state actors or non-state actors that are aspiring to be states, but maybe it doesn't need to be. So I just wasn't sure that you needed to do all of this work to say, here are the ways in which they're like political actors. Maybe it's enough to say, here are the things that they can do. Entities with these capacities are the entities that we have to end up using transitional justice processes with. It's just usually that they're also political.
Thank you. Isabel and then Pablo.
Sure. So for Diana's question, what kind of offers can or is the Colombian government doing to criminal groups? Actually, it is not really clear what the bargaining agenda is right now with organized criminal groups in Colombia. As Paulo said, on Wednesday, or it might have been on Tuesday, the government introduced a draft bill that was basically, that is to Congress, that is basically aimed at allowing the government to negotiate with these actors. And apparently the perspective that they are taking is more ordinary mechanisms, like the surrender policy, where organized criminal groups and combatants hand themselves over to government in exchange for lenient punishment if they lay down arms and confess their crimes. But at least in Colombia, this policy has not been really successful in dismantling organized criminal groups. And this is the key question in Colombia, particularly for drug trafficking, illicit mining, and extortion. What kind of under-the-table negotiation they are doing, because it has some legitimacy costs for the Petro administration, but in real politics, it is not sustainable that they are going to lay down arms and confess their crimes if they cannot have or retain any sort of wealth from illicit markets. So basically, that's the key question. And that's why I think that if we approach these issues as decoupling transitional justice from political transitions, we can be more honest about the sort of conversations that are at the table, instead of having this sort of dual relationship with organized criminal groups.
Well, thanks again for these questions. And so with Diana, and yeah, so I guess that a better way of putting it would be, if we think that transitional justice and doing this kind of pragmatic pacification bargains, etc., are urgent because of terrorizing of populations, etc., then maybe, hopefully, legalizations of drugs will happen. But I don't see, at least for cocaine, that happening within, I don't know, I have no idea, but let's say 20 years. And it would be desirable to have this before that. So I hope that happens. And perhaps even if, well, I want to think that experiences such as what I'm proposing or what Colombia is doing now would sort of help to sort of, I don't know, prepare the ground for that. But right now, the US, there's no strong power with a real commitment. Maybe the US slowly after, the experience with marijuana, then who knows, right? But for now, I just don't see it. So we cannot wait for that before doing this. So that's sort of the idea. Paulina, thanks very much for that. So if I were to refer, so I wouldn't say that my dilemma or the dilemma I'm presenting, and I didn't present it properly or really flesh it out, but it's not peace with corrupt politics versus violent but righteous law enforcement. I think you put it like that at some point. And yeah, I wouldn't propose that as a dilemma, and for several reasons. So one is that, this conceptualization that I'm offering, it's a kind of non-ideal theory, but there are some ideals or some sort of normative assumptions there, right? One of the assumptions is that if you do less aggressive law enforcement, so New York apparently pacified the drug business because they were less aggressive, so they use prosecutorial discretion with the care of not flaring up violence among drug traffickers and really sort of tolerating the business, small petty micro traffico to some extent. So it's something like that. So you have peace, and I wouldn't call it corrupt politics because it's clear, meaning you don't have to bribe anyone to avoid law enforcement. There's a commitment that law won't be enforced in that way. So if that's a credible policy, and it's a problem because it's politically toxic and the US won't like it, but if you did that, then corruption would go down because you don't need to bribe anyone to avoid law enforcement. There's a commitment against that kind of law enforcement, and organizations know that. So you will have peace with some drug business. And I don't think that's a terrible thing, but anyway, that's polemical, I guess. The other side would be to have violence, war against drugs. And I wouldn't call that righteous law enforcement. I don't think it's righteous. I think it's wrong, but it's law enforcement. It would be violence with wrongful law enforcement. And of course, if that's the dilemma, it's not really a dilemma. It's really, we should go for peace, right? But I agree with you. I wouldn't call it cessation of hostilities because I don't think we're talking, or usually it's not an armed conflict, I would say. So it's not hostilities, but it's not peace in a very thick Christian substantive love thy neighbor sense. It's really, let's not use weapons to secure illegal markets. It's a very bare, minimal, it's very close to cessation of hostilities, just it's really like ceasefires, perhaps is a better term, so that we don't assume that there are hostilities, but it's a very pragmatic, let's just not kill each other and take guns out of the illegal markets, if to the extent that it's possible. But all your points about why transitional justice is so fixated with peace and the concept of peace, it's really interesting. And I want to ask you more about your colleague co-author, because I'm curious about that. And Ashwini, it's a really good question again. And do we need big size to do meaning, or put differently, does my account of transitional justice need big size of the criminal organizations to take off? Isn't it, for example, enough to have large scale human rights violations? And I think we need that. We do need powerful actors, because the goal of transitional justice is to, in a way, weaken them and say something like, okay, you can do your business, you can be wealthy, but give up politics in a way, that give up your ugly politics in a way. And I was thinking when you were asking your question, the contrast with Haiti, with Haiti right now. And I don't know if you read recently, but Haiti is sort of going down in a really terrifying way. And what's happening is that all the criminal organizations, the youth gangs, are splintering and fragmenting, and they're controlling just 1-2 blocks. And you have these little organizations that are like little criminal organizations, but it's all quite petty, it seems, or judging from an article in the New York Times recently. And I don't think that would enable transitional justice. It's too many actors, they're too small. You don't have, it's impossible to negotiate with them. And so in that sense, I think you do need size and power.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Well, I think we've reached the point at which we should take a break. If there are more questions for Isabel and Pablo, maybe we can take them in the next round. So let's take 7 minutes, which would be 25 past the hour on my clock, and we'll come right back. And start again. And those who haven't asked a question, feel free, you can ask one to the earlier panelists too when we get to discussion. Paulina, can you hear me okay? Yes. And all right, so. Okay, so YouTube, see, okay. Let's start up again, and we have our last two speakers, Paulina Ochoa, professor of political science at Haverford College, who's the author of, hopefully the screen share comes through recently, On Borders, Territories, Legitimacy, and the Rights of Place, and then I'll introduce Ashwini when we come to Ashwini. And one thing to note, we're going to stop the YouTube recording of Ashwini's talk because it involves sensitive fieldwork questions. So we'll have YouTube for Paulina's and then stop it for Ashwini's. Paulina.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that I cannot be there, as you know. Tom, can you share my slides, or should I do that myself?
Why don't I just make you a co-host?
Oh, okay. If actually, let me see. It's just okay.
Right.
Hold on, just a sec.
Co-anfitrión, Paulina. Sí.
Okay.
Sí, Paulina Ochoa. It's coming. Gracias.
Okay. Okay, let me. Okay, just, I don't know if what you're seeing now.
Yes.
Okay, so I just, let me just start it from the beginning. How's that? Am I sharing a lot of stuff, or can you see it just clearly?
It's clear.
Okay, great. So, that's the title. That's what I'm interested in. My main question is, what is the harm of displacement? So for those who work on this theme, there are two main answers. Some think this is an individual harm, and other things that it is collective. And some think that it depends on what you abandon, on how you abandon it, or where you go after you leave the place where you were. So I want to offer a different view that focuses on place, specifically to what happens to people and places that are left behind after many people are forced to leave. So the main harm, I think, is not in the individual loss of the capacity to plan or choose, which is nowadays perhaps the main view, is that individuals are harmed because they lose the capacity to make plans in the future, but rather in the collective loss of the social and political conditions that then allow individuals to think and choose and plan. So to make those individual choices and to evaluate those choices and to plan ahead, you need a common world that people build together in particular places. And I understand this common world in terms of a network of place-specific duties that sustain collective life and environmental relations in grounded communities. And so I'm advancing two theses. First, I think I'm missing that slide, so pay attention. First, that the fundamental harm of displacement is the loss of a network of place-specific obligations that are essential for complex forms of social coordination, and thus for making and pursuing individual life plans. And this harm does not only affect those who leave, those who remain in spaces that are abandoned by mass displacement also lose a common world. And second, when local material infrastructure collapses because there are not enough people to sustain it, those who are left behind may suffer the harm of displacement even more than those who left or those who have to go somewhere else. So these points are not captured by the leading conceptions of IDPs. So I'm trying to supply this account of them. So usually philosophers and policymakers see that individual IDPs suffer harms, but they have so far neglected that those who are left behind also suffer. And the harms of displacement extend to the places themselves. And part of the reason why we don't often see is that philosophers have not really paid attention to the problem yet. I mean, I think that the reason why this may happen is that philosophers often take the perspective of the state, of the NGOs, or of those who can help. But maybe we should change the perspective from which we ask the question. So the most common conception of IDP refer to people who are in a situation such as this. So like those people in Mexico know exactly what I'm talking about, but in August 2021, there were several hundred people from a town in Michoacan, a state in the southwestern Mexico, just there, living in makeshift shelters in Tijuana, very close to the border gate in San Isidro, California, and they came from Aguililla. So this is where Aguililla is. This is the camp, and they were running away from their homes due to generalized violence that connected to the cartel wars in the region. So while they were in Tijuana, they were waiting to have their asylum cases heard in U.S. court. But they were waiting at the Mexican side of the border because due to the American legislation that was passed after COVID, it's called Title 42, and that prevents people from asking for asylum for health reasons, right? And the health reasons are that they might bring COVID in, at least that's the official idea. And so some of these people were interviewed, and in the radio interview, a woman who got tired of waiting for a hearing date said, moreover, she said that she probably wouldn't be given asylum because she did not personally suffer physical violence and she was not personally threatened by the cartels. Said she would go back to cousins in Monterrey or back to her town if she could. So while in the camp, she was an internally displaced person. And the interviewer wanted to emphasize how similar she was to a refugee. But because she's Mexican, and if she's in Monterrey with her cousin, she would just be a normal citizen. And she would not more be a displaced person than all the other people who have moved to the city or to Mexico City due to the mess, right? So she would fall out of the NGO's radar and the state radar as well. From the woman's perspective, the main concern was not where to go, but what had happened to her son who was still in Aguililla. That's what she really cared about. So what made her visible to the press, however, and to NGOs was that she was in Tijuana and she was like a refugee. So in the paper, I dedicate a section of why the perspective of a migrant matters, and I ended up taking it out because it was too long. But I wanted to emphasize it here because I think that the perspective of the state obviously captures important concerns, but it makes it harder to see many other issues. And some of these are the ones that I discuss here in the paper. And so is there some harm that is specific to the displaced person? I think that the harm would be the same if the person is in Tijuana or Monterrey, and whether the state sees her as an IDP. And more importantly, regardless of whether the state can offer remedies. And I think that we think in terms of the remedies that we can pursue rather than the harms that are actually being suffered. Now, the practice-based conception that comes from international institutions encourages to see the abstract individual and to focus on these remedies. So from the perspective of this displacement, this perspective, the main harm is the setback in this person's interest in their own autonomy. And so on this view, displacement is harmful because it disrupts individuals' capacity to be self-governing, to make, evaluate, and pursue life plans. And it is impossible to plan ahead when the sudden disruption of the background conditions of life due to the leaving of one's habitual place of residence or from the psychological disruption of losing one's home. So that's for sure one of the harms that IDPs suffer. But the main harm is not in the individual loss of the capacity to plan or choose, but rather in the collective loss of social and political conditions that allow individuals to think, choose, and plan. And to make individual choices, you need a common world that people build together in particular places. So I understand this common world, and these are like the traditional conception I wanted to focus on. And so I understand this common world in terms of a network of place-specific duties that sustain collective life and environmental relations in grounded communities. So what exactly do I mean by this? Well, I'm thinking about this locus of social coordination because it is the collective. It's not that we usually understand as a community on social and political relations that are sanctioned by law. They're relations attached to specific places, and the collective comes about by being together, by presence. So if this is right, then those who remain in spaces that are left behind by mass displacement also lose a common world, and they lose a place without going anywhere. So these conditions are those that make places functional through networks of social cooperation. And this cooperation is not only built on legal obligations, national, cultural, or social ties, it's mediated by material conditions in particular areas. For example, in Aguililla, so I mean, this has to do with how we coordinate action. So that's why I have that drive on the left. Usually, like, how do you, the obligations that you have to people that live close to you and that you only incur if you are in the same place that they are. So the conditions in this picture that we see, I'm sorry. So in Aguililla, for example, much of the violence has had to do with how the military and the narcos are fighting for control to the single road that allows access to the mountain town. So the conditions that allow for coordinating action in connected systems, such as traffic systems, distribution, finance, have to be in place for individuals to live their life, but also for communities to exist within functioning socio-ecological systems, if you will. I mean, this includes things like providing basic services, such as utilities, and things that have to do with the infrastructure of everyday life. So, for example, here in this picture, we see the people from Aguililla protesting, and what it says there is that the town lost basic services, including utilities, power, water. They don't have a bank. Farmers cannot bring products to the market. They cannot get to the hospital. And then in red, it says, we don't want to leave. Fleeing is not the solution, right? So there is something about losing a capacity to make plans. It's a crucial loss, but it's not the only one. So what displaced people lose is their world. And so the idea here is that you're acting together, but the social coordination that I have in mind is also necessary for like less lofty goals as, you know, collective freedom. It's a condition for basic needs. You need a common world to attain the everyday conditions of life, social coordination that are necessary for self-government, but also for plain old government, right? So not for other practices of living together in a given place, like organizing commercial activities, associational life, organized religion, creating infrastructure for circulation, commerce, transportation, etc. So I think that you don't recover this when you arrive to another place that has this world intact. So an individual in exile may reach a perfectly good community in the, when they become an asylee, and then they restore their ability to make plans. But when there is mass displacement, there will still be harms to the collective. So I often think about this example. I grew up in Mexico among Spanish refugees, and they came to Mexico after the Republic lost the civil war to Franco's Falange. And many of the refugees were highly skilled professionals who found work, respect, authority, and prestige in their new country. And they reorganized their community abroad. They even brought their government into exile with them. And they created associations and built schools and clubs, and they participated in politics and the art, and their children did very well. And however, they carried the Guernica with them, everywhere, in every common room, private chamber, because there was a symbol of something that could not be recovered. So in this case, planning blight, this inability to make plans, is not the main problem. There was something here. So this a harm specific to losing a place. I think that this has to do with these losses that are not experienced by the people who leave exclusively. So how are we doing time-wise? Okay, there, I guess I'm okay if nobody's telling me to shut up. So these are not experienced by IDP exclusively. Like the harms that you feel when you lose your place can be experienced by other people who lose their home. For example, somebody who has to leave their home because the roof falls in or something like that, shares a lot of things in common with those who are displaced, but we wouldn't call them internally displaced people, even if they had the same conditions, because the background conditions of their life are intact. They have their family, their neighbors, their neighborhood, park, supermarket, and the habitual spaces are still there. So it's not only that you lose your home, it also has to do with the lost world that you make with others. So such disruptions destroy that network of place-specific duties that they share together. So in the paper, I give also the example of the tornadoes or climate displacement. And what matters there is not only the physical devastation, is that without the material conditions to mediate and the social relations, also the place is gone. And so those who experience that loss are also the people who are left behind. So those in Tijuana, of course, lost Aguililla, but also those who stay behind lost the town. And those who have found safety as refugees or IDPs in the city still have lost that network of place-specific obligations that were not, those who were not able to leave the town have the greatest interest in restoring. So the condition of IDP is not that you're violently yanked from your place, is that the place has been violently turned away from you. And this is a very important harm. So while individuals who make the difficult choice to leave their homes are clearly harmed because they cannot make plans and must find a place to call home, those who stand behind also suffer the harm of displacement. But in addition, they're often in no position to rebuild the communities or start anew in their individual lives. So.
Thank you very much, Paulina. All right. Vamos a parar el YouTube. We're stopping the YouTube because Ashwini has